I will say all these smiling faces really are a testament to Paul, because he had a million friends from the time I met him till the time he passed. I met Paul through a friend, mutual friend, lived near him, 2 doors away. And it didn't take long to get close to Paul. He, as you've heard, he was always the nicest guy in the neighborhood. And I was happy to be welcome at his house. I met his family, his folks, and we had a lot of good times together. Paul used to spend quite a bit of time at my house too. And my folks actually started to really like Paul. He came across them as a top-notch guy. I had other friends that came over, but nobody got treated as good as Paul did. My 2 sisters both really liked him too. Usually teenage girls, they don't always get along with the brothers' friends and stuff, but I liked Paul enough where I decided to adopt him. And I talked to my folks and my sisters, and everybody agreed that would be a great idea. So we talked to him about it, and he says, well, all right. So he effectively became my brother I never had. And I really appreciated that, and I'll never forget that. Back at the time we were running around together, after that we had a lot to do with chasing around with the local bands. He knew most of the kids that were in them. We went to the practices that they had. We went to rock and roll dances, traveled all over the area with all those friends, and more or less to see the bands. Paul was there on my first date. My wife, Jan, the love of my life. We went to a movie, came back, we walked back. Everybody walked everywhere. Nobody had a car hardly. Paul had the use of his mom's car, and he stopped by, pulled up in front of Jan's house, and he waited quietly while I was up there fumbling around, trying to get comfortable, trying to see if I could steal a kiss goodnight. And Paul got antsy and hollered out the window, for God's sake, kiss her and get it over with. I went over to Paul's house lots of times, especially in the morning to get him out of bed, because he was a late sleeper. But I was amazed. I walked into the house and his mom says, they're upstairs, they're still in bed. And she says, go on up. So I went up and the door was shut, so I knocked on it, and pushed the door open and looked in the room, and they had a window open. And it was a good-sized window. It was wide open, and the wind was whistling in, and I looked around the room, and there was frost on the walls. It was cold. I could see my breath. And I looked over at the 2, Butch and Paul, sound asleep, blankets up here. And I thought, I'm not going to wake him up right now. So I went back downstairs and visited with his mom a little bit. She went up and woke him up. So at that, he kind of got things together, and we went traipsing around every day like we did, what we called cruising when he had mom's car. There was a time when he came over to my house, and which was many times really, but this particular time was notable because I had to change clothes and went upstairs. And he came in and he was talking to my folks, and he kind of used to fold his arms, and he leaned over like this against the archway between the dining room and the front room. And he went to sleep. And I thought, my dad looked at him, and when I came downstairs, he says, I think he's sleeping. And I walked there, I'll wake him up, you know. He says, no, don't touch him. He says, he might tip over. So hung on to his arm, and they woke him up, and he came to and looked around, and he didn't even realize he was sleeping. But he laughed about it. It was funny, which is the habit he had of doing everything with a laugh. He turned everything into something kind of funny, kind of comical. At the same time, serious things stayed serious. He did a great job of making people feel good about bad situations, things like that. Paul had a knack. And obviously, with all the friends he's got here, you know he really had a knack for doing it. He was a lovable guy in everybody's book. I remember was working at A&W Root Beer. My dad came walking in and he said, I got some bad news. And I said, what happened? Right away, what happened? And he says, well, Paul got thrown off a horse, thrown into a tree, and it broke his leg. So he's over in the hospital. And you might want to get off earlier. If you can, go see him. So I did, and went and saw him lots of times. He spent months in that hospital, and he had everything you can imagine for complications. He had infections, he had everything. And then he finally got to go home, and he spent months at home in bed. And I'd go over there and spend some time with him. And we had our own thing going. We invented card games, did all kinds of things to occupy time. And Paul was always good. He was always up. He always wanted to say something that was going to get you laughing or get you to smile. That was Paul. When I went into service in about 62, I spent a lot of time away, 4 years to be away, and a lot of things changed and a lot of people came and went. But when I got back, even when I was in the service, I heard from Paul every once in a while. But when I got back, I found that bond that we had was still there. And whenever we could, we'd do things together. Whenever we could, we'd make sure that the other knew that we were going to be there in case you needed anything. And that was always the case. 1966, I got married, and that was my love of my life, as I mentioned. A year later, Joan and Paul got married, a year and a month. And we started raising families, looking for places to live, trying to keep decent jobs, decent jobs so that we could raise our family comfortably. And I tried to spend time doing things with them, but our lives kind of went different directions. Kids came at different kinds. We did do some camping. We did do some snowmobiling. We had some good times after that. But all the way through all these times, we still had this bond between us. And Paul was through work, and he'd sometimes stop by and see how we were doing and what was going on. And when he retired, he'd stop by on Wednesdays because he'd go into town on Wednesdays and go have pizza with the guys he used to work with and stuff. And he'd stop by and see me. And even when I wasn't home, he'd stop by and he'd push the door open. And Jan would be there and he'd holler, "Honey, I'm home." She always laughed at that, and she still does. And the way things worked out, I was so shocked to hear what happened. I literally couldn't talk. But being my buddy all these years, I how do you miss Paul? I love the guy, and I'll never forget him.
And that is why